Max Verstappen was destroying the Nürburgring. 21 straight hours leading the most dangerous endurance race on Earth. Almost 40 seconds ahead. Mercedes completely in control. And then, the car started making a noise that instantly terrified the entire garage. Not a crash. Not a mistake. A silent mechanical failure that ripped victory away from Verstappen just 3 hours before the finish line. And the worst part is this. The disaster may have actually started much earlier, during one horrifying moment at over 200 km per hour, when Verstappen nearly slammed his Mercedes into the barriers at the Nürburgring's most feared section. At the time, people called it an incredible save. Now, engineers believe that exact moment may have secretly destroyed the car from the inside, while Verstappen kept dominating the race anyway. Toto Wolff could barely believe what he was watching. Because this was not supposed to happen to Mercedes. Not after 21 hours of perfection. Not when victory was already theirs. And once you hear how this collapse really happened, the entire ending becomes even more brutal. At first, almost nobody expected Max Verstappen to dominate this race the way he did. Not because of talent. Nobody questions that anymore. The real concern was the Nürburgring itself. This place is different from Formula 1. Completely different. Formula 1 circuits are controlled. Predictable. Wide. Modern. The Nordschleife feels like the opposite of all that. Narrow roads. Blind corners. Violent elevation changes. Cars flying past each other with massive speed differences. And this race was even worse. 161 cars sharing the same track at the same time. Imagine driving flat out on a dark mountain road while traffic appears around every corner without warning. That is basically what drivers experience here for 24 straight hours. That is why Mercedes approached the opening of the race very carefully. Instead of throwing Verstappen into the chaos immediately, the team started with Danny Juncadella behind the wheel. Quietly. Strategically. At first, it did not seem important. But later, that decision looked brilliant. Because Mercedes wanted Verstappen fresh for the most dangerous phase of the race. The night stints. The cold conditions. The moments where concentration starts disappearing and even experienced endurance drivers make catastrophic mistakes. And honestly, the plan worked perfectly in the beginning. Juncadella handled the opening traffic calmly while the Mercedes slowly climbed through the field. No panic. No unnecessary risks. Just controlled aggression. Then Verstappen finally stepped into the car. And only minutes later, the Nürburgring almost destroyed everything. The moment happened at Spiegelheuch, one of the most feared sections anywhere in motorsport. A crest so violent that GT3 cars literally leave the ground at terrifying speed. And Verstappen hit it at exactly the wrong angle. Suddenly, the front of the Mercedes lifted into the air. The car drifted sideways. Straight toward the barriers. For a split second, it looked over. Completely over. The onboard footage made it even scarier because the Mercedes no longer looked connected to the road. It looked weightless. Floating. Most drivers probably crashed there. Verstappen somehow saved it with tiny steering corrections and pure instinct. No panic. No hesitation. At the time, everyone called it one of the best saves of the race. But here is where the story becomes much darker. Because many now believe that exact moment may have secretly damaged the car from the inside. Not visibly. Not immediately. Tiny microscopic fractures inside the drivetrain. The kind of hidden damage that stays silent for hours before suddenly becoming catastrophic. And the terrifying part is this. Nobody inside Mercedes knew it yet. Because after that near disaster, Verstappen did not slow down. He became even faster. Within the next few hours, the entire race changed completely. What started as a careful strategy suddenly turned into total domination. Verstappen began cutting through the field one car at a time, and the scary part was how comfortable he looked doing it. No overdriving. No desperation. No visible pressure. Just precision. First came the battle with the Lamborghini. A long, aggressive fight that forced Verstappen to stay inches away from disaster for lap after lap. And this is what makes the Nürburgring terrifying compared to normal circuits. At tracks like Silverstone or Austin, drivers usually have runoff areas. Space. Room for mistakes. At the Nordschleife, the barriers are waiting immediately beside you. One tiny error and the race is over instantly. But Verstappen looked completely locked in. He finally cleared the Lamborghini, then immediately shifted focus toward the next target. The Grello Porsche. One of the strongest endurance racing cars on the grid. The car many people expected to dominate once the race entered the night phase. Verstappen chased it down anyway. Corner after corner, the gap started shrinking. And once he reached the back of the Porsche, the pressure inside the cockpit must have been unbelievable. Because overtaking at the Nürburgring is not like overtaking in Formula 1. Here, drivers are constantly dealing with slower traffic while fighting cars from their own class at the same time. Imagine trying to sprint through a crowded subway station while people suddenly stop in front of you without warning. That is basically what endurance drivers experience every lap here. And somehow, Verstappen made it look controlled. Then finally, he made the move for the lead. The Mercedes number 3 officially took control of the Nürburgring 24 hours less than 3 hours into the race. That moment completely changed the atmosphere around the event. Because suddenly, this was no longer a Formula 1 champion trying endurance racing for fun. Now people inside the paddock started realizing something much bigger. Max Verstappen could actually win this race on his first serious attempt. And once night arrived, things became even more impressive. Because the darkness at the Nürburgring changes everything. Visibility drops. Temperatures fall. Fatigue starts attacking concentration. This is usually where races collapse. But somehow, Verstappen looked even stronger after sunset. That was the terrifying part for the competition. The Mercedes number 3 did not just stay competitive. It started disappearing into the distance. The lead kept growing. 10 seconds. 20 seconds. Nearly 40 seconds at one point. 40 seconds at the Nordschleife feels enormous. On a circuit this long, that gap means one team is operating at a completely different level from everybody else. The pit stops looked clean. The strategy looked flawless. The driver rotation worked perfectly. Everything inside the Mercedes garage felt calm, confident, almost relaxed. And this is where the emotional side of the story becomes important. Because after hour of control, Mercedes probably started believing the race was already won. Honestly, most teams would. Very few cars dominate the Nürburgring for 21 straight hours and still lose. Especially not with Verstappen driving like this. But hidden underneath all that control, the Mercedes may already have been slowly destroying itself from the inside. And nobody realized the nightmare was already beginning. Then came the sound that changed everything. At first, almost nobody noticed it. The Mercedes was still leading comfortably. The lap time still looked strong. Nothing on the timing screen suggested disaster was coming. But inside the car, something felt wrong. A strange metallic noise started coming from the rear of the Mercedes. And this is where endurance racing becomes psychologically brutal. Because unlike a sudden crash, mechanical failures often arrive slowly, quietly, like a ticking clock nobody can stop. At first, the sound was subtle. The kind of noise drivers sometimes try to ignore during long races because these cars are constantly under pressure. Vibrations, harsh impacts, stress everywhere. But this noise kept getting worse. Lap after lap, fans listening to the onboard cameras could actually hear the problem evolving in real time. That detail makes this story even darker. People were literally listening to the Mercedes destroy itself while Verstappen's dream slowly collapsed from the inside. And nobody could stop it. The noise became sharper, more aggressive, metallic, irregular. Like the car was warning the team that something deep inside the drivetrain was failing. But the lead was enormous. Nearly 40 seconds. So the team kept pushing forward. And honestly, you can understand why. When you are dominating the Nürburgring after 21 exhausting hours, the finish line starts feeling emotionally close even when several hours still remain. That changes how teams think. You stop imagining failure. You start imagining victory. And this is exactly why what happened next felt so shocking inside Mercedes. Because the problem suddenly became impossible to hide. Danny Juncadella could feel the rear of the car behaving strangely. The suspension no longer felt stable. Something underneath the Mercedes was breaking apart. The car finally returned to the garage. And within moments, the mechanics understood the nightmare they were facing. The transmission shaft had failed. Now for casual fans, that may not sound catastrophic immediately. But imagine riding a bicycle when the chain suddenly snaps under pressure. Your legs still move. The pedals still spin. But the power never reaches the wheels anymore. That is essentially what happened here. The transmission shaft is responsible for transferring power from the engine to the rear wheels. Without it, the car becomes helpless. And the situation became even worse seconds later. Because the broken shaft had already damaged multiple surrounding components. The wheel carrier suffered damage. Additional rear suspension parts were affected. The failure spread like falling dominoes through the rear of the car. That is what truly stunned Mercedes. This was no quick repair anymore. At the Nürburgring, replacing a single damaged component already takes precious time. But once the damage spreads across multiple structural parts, the repair becomes painfully complicated. And time was disappearing fast. Only 3 hours remained in the race. 3 hours separating Verstappen from one of the biggest victories outside Formula 1 of his entire career. At first, Mercedes still tried to stay optimistic publicly. Team boss Steve Bushman said they would repair the car and return to the track. But inside the garage, reality was becoming impossible to ignore. The mechanics were no longer fighting for victory. Now they were fighting the clock itself. And slowly, the atmosphere inside Mercedes changed from confidence to disbelief. And then, finally, Mercedes made the decision nobody inside that garage wanted to hear. The car was retiring. After 21 hours leading the Nürburgring 24 hours, Max Verstappen's Mercedes was officially out of the race. Just like that. No dramatic crash for television cameras. No fire. No huge explosion. Only silence. And honestly, that silence may have been the most painful part of the entire story. Because crashes feel violent. Immediate. Emotional. This felt empty. Like watching someone climb a mountain for an entire day, only to fall a few steps before reaching the top. The timing made it even crueler. Mercedes was not surviving anymore. They were dominating. Almost 40 seconds ahead. 3 hours remaining. Everything under control. Statistically, races almost never collapse from that position. Especially not with Max Verstappen behind the wheel. And this is why the reaction across the paddock became so emotional afterward. People were not just surprised. They were genuinely stunned. Because Verstappen had already beaten the hardest parts of the Nürburgring. The terrifying opening traffic. The endless night stints. The mental exhaustion. The pressure of leading for hours. He handled all of it like an elite endurance specialist. That is what made this defeat feel so unfair. And then came the most brutal irony of all. Another Mercedes won the race. The Mercedes number 80 inherited the lead after Verstappen's retirement and eventually crossed the finish line first. Same manufacturer. Same GT3 platform. Completely opposite emotions. Imagine what that must have felt like inside Mercedes. One garage celebrating victory. Another garage completely devastated. One Mercedes becoming the hero of the Nürburgring. The other becoming the heartbreak everyone would remember. And this is where Toto Wolff reportedly became deeply shocked by the entire collapse. Because this was not supposed to happen to Mercedes. Not after 21 hours of flawless execution. Not after controlling the race so comfortably. Not after Verstappen delivered one of the strongest endurance performances of his career. But the deeper truth may be even more painful. Because engineers later suggested the race may have actually been lost during that terrifying airborne moment early in the event. That near crash at Spiegelhuge. The moment where Verstappen somehow kept the car out of the barriers at over 200 kilometers per hour. At the time, everyone celebrated the save. Now, many believe the impact may have created tiny microscopic fractures inside the drivetrain. Small hidden weaknesses impossible to detect immediately. And if that is true, it changes the entire story. Because it means the Mercedes may have been slowly dying for almost the whole race, while still dominating everybody else. Think about how terrifying that really is. A wounded car. A hidden failure. 21 hours of punishment. And somehow, Verstappen still built a massive lead before the machine finally gave up underneath him. That is why so many people inside motorsport left the Nürburgring with a completely different level of respect for him afterward. Because this race proved something important. Max Verstappen is not just a Formula One driver dominating one category. He can step into one of the most dangerous endurance races on Earth, against experienced specialists, and immediately become the fastest and most feared driver on the track. And honestly, that realization may scare his rivals far more than the retirement itself. Because if Verstappen was already this dangerous in his first real Nürburgring attempt, what happens next time?